Welcome back, everyone. 14 after the hour. Time for us to go behind the headlines. And today I pick up out of the Seattle Times a post from the Associated Press that reads, pot-related poison control calls up in Washington and Colorado. Now, we've heard about these stories in the past. Every time there's some new number from the Poison Control Center showing an increase in marijuana overdoses, we get these alarmist headlines in the newspapers. And before I get too deeply into this, I want to address someone that corrected me on Twitter to say, there's no such thing as a marijuana overdose, silly. Well, folks, there is such a thing as a marijuana overdose. What people get confused about is typically overdose goes along with the word death. When you hear heroin overdose or alcohol overdose, it can also often mean death. Overdose does not always necessarily mean death. It just means taking more than you intended to and having a bad reaction from it. So there is indeed a marijuana overdose. In fact, I can testify there is such a thing. It has happened to me. I once took a mega dab in Los Angeles that overdosed me so bad I was laying in a street gutter, dry heaving my guts out. So I understand there is such a thing as a marijuana overdose, and it is not a pleasant thing to experience. It's not going to kill you. It'll wear off in an hour or two. But it's definitely not something that we would wish on anyone. So let's be serious about that as we discuss the issue that there is such a thing as a marijuana overdose, and it is something we want to avoid. We want people to not experience this and give marijuana legalization a bad name. Now, with that expressed, let's also express the fact that these headlines are alarmist because they ignore a very salient point, which is we do not know whether overdoses have increased. All we know is that the reporting of overdoses has increased. And one thing about this story in the Associated Press that has kind of given me some hope is it seems that that message is starting to make it to the mainstream. The first paragraph in this report talks about how marijuana-related calls to poison control centers in Washington and Colorado have spiked since they legalized. But in the next paragraph says, it's not clear how much of the increase might be related to more people using marijuana as opposed to people feeling more comfortable to report their problems now that the drug is legal. And that, I would argue, is a large reason for the increase that we are seeing. A large reason because in the past, if you were having a bad reaction to marijuana, the only person you could tell was your friend, and they would just tell you to ride it out. You wouldn't think to go to the hospital for fear that your possession or use of marijuana could land you with an arrest and a criminal record. So a large portion of this must be related to just increased comfort with reporting this, especially with respect to children, where parents might fear Child Protective Services for their use of illegal marijuana. They might not fear it so much when it comes to a legal marijuana state. That said, the numbers that we have show that in the Rocky Mountain Poison Control Center, they received 151 calls for marijuana exposure. That was up from 88 the year before and 61 in 2012. Now, keep in mind, in 2012, marijuana was illegal in Colorado for people without a red card. In 2013, it was legal, but there was no place to purchase it. And in 2014 is when purchases began. So seeing a rise from 88 during a legal regime to 151 after sales begin does lend some credence to the idea that this increased access to marijuana is leading to more over-ingestions. The secondary argument I would make after the increased reporting is that we are actually incentivizing some of these accidental marijuana overexposures by failing to give adults, especially those whose last experience with marijuana was smoking a joint in the dorm room 30 years ago, we are failing to give them a place to smoke marijuana. Public consumption of marijuana is illegal, and Denver and Colorado are not allowing for public use lounges, vapor lounges, coffee shops, whatever you want to call them. So when someone wants to try the newly legal marijuana and they're not allowed to be able to smoke it, the next thing they turn to is the edible without realizing how even professional pot smokers like myself don't touch edibles without a lot of care and consideration. The fact is that marijuana metabolizes differently in the stomach than it does going through the lungs. Going through the lungs, we get delta-9 THC, the chemical we're all familiar with that gets you high. But through the stomach, it metabolizes into 11-hydroxy THC, a substance that's 9 times more psychoactive. So even experienced smokers like myself will be very careful when it comes to edibles. We need to incentivize and provide ways for people to use the marijuana they're used to, the marijuana smoking or vaporization, where they can self-titrate that dose and know exactly how high they're going to get, rather than expecting to play Russian roulette with an edible they have very little experience with. These numbers call for more education, which is already taking place in Colorado with their campaigns to go slow and start low, and more explicit labeling and understanding and demonstration and explanation from the bud tenders on how to properly consume marijuana edibles. The solution to this is not lower dosage edibles. It is not bans on edibles. People will get around those, and as we've always learned, prohibition doesn't work. Let's turn to education. Let's turn to better information for the consumer, and we will see this level out.